After Jamaica gained independence on August 6, 1962, the newly elected Prime Minister Alexander Bustamante immediately discontinued Norman Manley's Africa project. This decision did not stop the repatriation movement. Instead, it forced its advocates to redirect their efforts. It later became clear that Manley's support of the Back to Africa mission had not been entirely sincere. His hope had been that Rastafarians would witness the living conditions in Africa and reconsider their desire for repatriation. Instead, the plan backfired. The Rastafarians returned to Jamaica more determined than before, and African leaders themselves had shown that they were receptive to the idea of resettlement. With Manley now out of power and Bustamante standing firmly against Rastafari repatriation, the movement began seeking support from international bodies. One of the leading figures in this effort was Sam Brown, who had challenged the two cousins Manley's PNP and Bustamante's JLP in the 1962 general elections. Brown had hoped that a seat in government would allow him to push the repatriation agenda from within. But after his defeat, he grew increasingly uncertain about the future. Frustrated but determined, Sam Brown wrote directly to Emperor Haile Selassie and the United Nations, declaring, "We are blocked politically and economically in Jamaica, to the extent that our talents go to waste in building interest we cannot own." The letter was sent through Ethiopia's finance minister, Yilma Deresa, in the hope that the emperor would hear the plight of the Rastafari in Jamaica. It was almost as if Sam Brown foresaw what was to come. The years that followed under the Bustamante government would be marked by growing hostility toward the Rastafari movement. The turning point came in 1963 with the Coral Gardens incident. The incident began in April 1963 at a gas station in Coral Gardens, St. James, where a confrontation between Rastafarians and police led to deaths and injuries. In response, Bustamante declared a state of emergency and ordered a sweeping crackdown on Rastafarians across Jamaica. Police and soldiers carried out mass arrests, beatings, and killings, detaining hundreds of Rastafarians, many of whom had no connection to the original incident. Detainees were held in prisons and detention camps where many were abused and tortured. The Coral Gardens incident, often referred to as the Coral Gardens Massacre, became one of the most brutal state crackdowns in Jamaica's modern history and permanently deepened the divide between the Rastafari movement and the Jamaican government. Bustamante, who had shown contempt toward Leonard Howell and the Rastafari movement since the 1930s, showed no leniency. He reportedly gave police the green light to bring in every Rastaman, dead or alive. Although the violence began on the island's northwestern coast, fear spread throughout Kingston. Rastafarians in the capital, fearing a wider assault, threatened to burn the city if the attacks reached Kingston. At the same time, in what appeared to be a broader effort to dismantle Rastafari communities, the newly elected Member of Parliament for West Kingston, Edward Seaga, launched Operation Shantytown. The operation was presented as an urban renewal project intended to remove the Bacawal slum, then considered the largest slum in the Caribbean. Seaga blamed the existence of Bacawal on the failures of Manley and the PNP government. While the project was presented as redevelopment, what followed over the next 3 years were mass evictions, harassment, arrests, bulldozing of homes, and the burning of entire communities. Among those affected was Prince Emmanuel, whose camp at Aki Walk was burned down in 1963. Also impacted were Gladstone Graham and Trevor Campbell of the Rastafari Brethren United Front, RBUF, one of several Rastafari groups engaged in dialogue with the Bustamante government. Citing international law and the Ethiopian constitution, the RBUF demanded to be recognized lawfully as Ethiopians and called for their inalienable rights to be recognized as Ethiopian nationals by acquisition. Their demand remained clear: repatriation and the resettlement of we, the persons of the West. On June 6th, Bustamante responded bluntly,
"Thanks for your letter on the 5th of June regarding repatriation to Ethiopia. I do not want to hear anything more of this nonsense. If you want to go, pay your own fares."
Again, on August 11, 1963, as Operation Shantytown intensified, Graham and Campbell sent letters not only to the Jamaican government, but also to the United Nations and Ethiopian Prime Minister Aklilu Wold, hoping for intervention. Bustamante's reply was short and dismissive. Meanwhile, on the eastern side of Kingston, 2 members of the 1961 mission to Africa also faced persecution upon their return. A few months after returning to Jamaica, police raided the camp of Douglas Mack in the Warika Hills. Held at gunpoint, the men were forced to watch as their homes and possessions were burned to the ground, including books, documents, and memorabilia from their Africa mission. 2 years later, in 1963, in the midst of widespread persecution of the Rastafari community in the Montego Bay area, Douglas Mack and Filmore Alvaranga decided to travel there to assess the situation for themselves. Before making the journey north, it had become increasingly clear that an island-wide attack on the Rastafari movement seemed imminent. As a result, Mack and Alvaranga requested a meeting with Prime Minister Alexander Bustamante, who agreed to see them at his office on East Racecourse. The delegation included Douglas Mack, Filmore Alvaranga, Count Ossie, and a brother Moses. They met with Bustamante and the Commissioner of Police, H. Gordon Langdon. When the Rastafari delegation questioned why the government was allowing the violence and killings to continue, the commissioner responded by suggesting that the Rastafari movement had declared war on Jamaican society. The Rastafari Brethren strongly denied this accusation, pointing out that they had lived peacefully throughout the island and had caused no disturbance. Bustamante, at least in the meeting, appeared to agree. In addition to discussing the violence surrounding the Coral Gardens incident, the delegation also pressed Bustamante to revive the Back to Africa mission. His response was blunt.
Not one penny would be spent on such venture.
The group left the meeting and made their way to Montego Bay. During their earlier meeting, the Prime Minister had warned them about their safety if they traveled to the North Coast. Mack and Alvaranga decided to take the risk anyway. What they saw confirmed their worst fears. After witnessing the situation firsthand, they sent communication to Prime Minister Bustamante demanding an end to the killings and mass imprisonment. They also sent letters to several African governments and the United Nations, accusing the Jamaican government of genocide against the Rastafari people and calling for international intervention. With tensions in Jamaica escalating, Mack and Alvaranga became even more determined to leave the island and carry out an independent fact-finding mission in Africa, while also bringing their case before the United Nations. However, they were barely making ends meet, and with Alexander Bustamante refusing to sponsor a follow-up mission to Africa, they turned to fundraising. They reached out to a Mr. Reed, who owned a club called Adastra Gardens. Reed supported the effort, becoming the first to donate and providing letters of recommendation to other businessmen who might help. The group then organized a series of fundraising dances across the island. These events were successful, as the group included well-known musicians such as Count Ossie and Don Drummond. Popular sound systems of the day, including Coxsone's Downbeat and Duke Reed's sound system, also performed, drawing large crowds. This was before the rise of reggae, during the era when a ska and the emerging rocksteady sound dominated Jamaica. The fundraising effort proved successful. On December 22nd, Douglas Mack and Filmore Alvaranga departed for their journey, their first stop being New York City. As on their previous trip in 1961, they were met by members of the Ethiopian World Federation and the UNIA, and immediately attended services at the Ethiopian Orthodox Church in Harlem. After the service, Mack and Alvaranga addressed the congregation and explained the purpose of their mission to Africa. Gladstone Robinson, a member of the Ethiopian World Federation, volunteered to host the Jamaican visitors in his Brooklyn apartment. During their 4-month stay in the United States, Robinson accommodated Douglas Mack, Filmore Alvaranga, and later Sam Clayton, who arrived in early January 1964. Shortly after Clayton's arrival, the group went to the United Nations hoping to meet Secretary General U Thant. In the winter snow, the group made their way to the United Nations headquarters, only to learn upon arrival that U Thant was away in Cairo. Nevertheless, the Rastafarians met with Mushin Lin and Pedro Yap, who were under-secretaries to the Secretary General. The delegation presented their petition bearing over 3,000 signatures from Jamaica. accusing the Jamaican government of discriminatory and genocidal acts against the Rastafari community. The petition also included demands for reparations from the colonial governments that had profited from the slave trade to be used to resettle black people in the West who desired to return to Africa. The United Nations representatives informed the delegation that a member state would need to sponsor their case in order for the organization to formally investigate. Knowing that the delegation intended to travel to Africa, the UN officials encouraged them to appeal directly to African governments for sponsorship. The Rastafarians then traveled to Washington, D.C., where they met with several African ambassadors, hoping one of the newly independent African nations would sponsor their mission and allow them to continue the diplomatic dialogues that had begun during the 1961 visit to Africa. The embassies, however, made no firm commitments. As a result, Mack, Clayton, and Alvaranga, with the help of their contacts in New York, began holding meetings to raise funds. Gladstone Robinson's Brooklyn apartment became their headquarters, and it was there that an organization was formed, the African Repatriation Committee, ARC. Robinson was chosen as chairman of the group, which also included a treasurer, Sister Roslyn, and a general secretary known as Brother Dago. The Jamaican Rastafari brethren Sam Clayton, Filmore Alvaranga, and Douglas Mack were chosen to serve as ambassadors of the organization. The New York members of the ARC were also closely associated with a group of African Americans known as the House of Judah, which also nominated the 3 Jamaicans as ambassadors of their organization. Together, the ARC and the House of Judah held a number of fundraising events, after which they were able to afford passage to Nigeria. Prior to their departure, the Jamaican visitors met the world-famous heavyweight boxing champion Muhammad Ali. They received an autograph from the boxer and, in return, presented him with a copy of J.A. Rogers' book, 100 Amazing Facts About the Negro. They had hoped Ali would arrange a meeting between them and Malcolm X, but Malcolm X was sadly assassinated before such a meeting could take place. On April 29, 1964, the group departed for Lagos, Nigeria. There they were met by Babatunde Harper and Mr. Adeoye of the Nigerian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The Rastafarians presented their requests to the government, primarily seeking meetings with ministers concerning settlement in Nigeria, accommodations during their stay, and assistance with travel arrangements to Addis Ababa after their time in Nigeria. The Rastafarians were provided accommodations for 2 weeks, during which time they were denied any meetings with government ministers. Mr. Adeoye eventually visited them to inform them that the government would no longer be able to accommodate them, and that they would have to return to Jamaica. The Rastafarians refused to leave. Instead, they stayed for a time with a Nigerian man with Jamaican parentage, Akintola Moss, who had once been Douglas Mack's schoolmate in Jamaica. Still unable to secure an audience with government officials and with very little money left to continue their journey to Ethiopia, the Jamaicans received unexpected assistance from a familiar face. By coincidence, Muhammad Ali, whom Mack, Clayton, and Alvaranga had met earlier in New York, was also in Nigeria. After renewing their acquaintance and explaining their mission and the difficulties they were facing, Ali extended a hand of generosity and offered assistance. Around this time, the Rastafarians learned that Dr. Michael Okpara, Premier of Eastern Nigeria, was scheduled to arrive in Lagos for government meetings. The Rastafarians went to the airport and met him as he landed. Dr. Okpara received them warmly, reportedly greeting them by saying, "These are my Jamaican friends." He invited them to join his entourage, giving them the opportunity to explain their mission and the Nigerian government's refusal to assist them. Dr. Okpara promised that he would help and that he would personally speak to Prime Minister Abubakar Tafawa Balewa on their behalf. Dr. Okpara also informed the Rastafarians that he intended to develop the sugar industry in eastern Nigeria and was interested in receiving assistance from Jamaicans who had experience in the field. Before departing, he expressed his intention to visit Jamaica and told the Rastafarians that he would remain in contact. After several hostile interactions with Mr. Adeoye, who at one point even threatened the Jamaicans with jail if they refused to return to their island, he eventually returned with news from the Nigerian federal government. He informed them that arrangements had been made for the delegation to fly to Nairobi, Kenya. In August 1964, the Rastafarian delegation arrived in Nairobi, Kenya. 2 days after their arrival, they met with a delegation sent by President Jomo Kenyatta. Among those who met them was Paul Nduritu, who informed the Jamaican visitors that the president had arranged accommodations for them in a village outside the city. The group then traveled in a motorcade some 26 miles from Nairobi to the Kiambu district, located on the slopes of Mount Kenya. While in Kiambu, the Rastafarians learned that Paul Nduritu and many of the villagers had been vanguards in the Mau Mau uprising. The villagers spent hours sharing stories of the struggle and the fight for Kenyan independence, giving the Jamaican visitors a deeper understanding of Kenya's recent revolutionary past. The group would eventually meet with Oginga Odinga, Kenya's Minister of Interior. After listening to the delegation explain the purpose of their mission, Odinga promised that he would present their request directly to the president. The Rastafarians also met with Tom Mboya at the headquarters of the Kenyan African National Union, KANU. These meetings placed the Jamaican delegation in direct contact with some of the most important political figures in newly independent Kenya. During their stay, the Rastafarians also met members of the Kenyan African Church, who, according to the delegation, based their teachings on the divinity of Emperor Haile Selassie. Members of the church were also said to follow Nazarite traditions, not shaving their hair or beards. This discovery shocked the Jamaican Rastafarians, who found that these Kenyans practiced beliefs and customs very similar to their own. The three delegates, Sam Clayton, Filmore Alvaranga, and Douglas Mack, spent approximately 4 months in Kenya immersing themselves in the culture, learning local languages, and even speaking at several schools about Jamaica and the Caribbean. One day, the delegation received word from Oginga Odinga, and they met with him again in Nairobi. Odinga informed the Jamaican visitors that President Kenyatta had deliberately arranged for them to stay in Kiambu so that they could experience the authentic culture and life of Kenya firsthand. Odinga then told them that the government had arranged their flights to Addis Ababa, as they had requested. After 4 months in Kenya, Mack, Clayton, and Alvaranga had not held many formal discussions with the Kenyan government specifically about repatriation. However, one significant development came from the Council of Bishops of the Kenyan Independent Communion Churches of East Africa, which formally proposed the strengthening of relationships between Africans and people of African descent in the Caribbean and the United States. On behalf of the Council, Bishop Felix Indirangu wrote,
"The Council of Bishops, along with KANU, its parliamentarians and government leaders, strongly support the return to Africa of the grandsons of Africa from Jamaica and the USA, and elsewhere in the world, as their being in those foreign lands was not by their own doing, but by the wicked works of imperialists who have disturbed Africa in the past and continue to do so now."
In the letter, the bishops affirmed their commitment to assisting in the settlement of people of African descent from the West. They also called for representatives from the West to come to Africa to help prepare homes and to discuss the logistics necessary for future resettlement. In November 1964, Sam Clayton, Douglas Mack, and Filmore Alvaranga arrived in Addis Ababa. For Alvaranga and Mack, this was their second visit to Ethiopia. But for Sam Clayton, it was his first time in the land that held such deep spiritual meaning for the Rastafari movement. Upon their arrival, they were met by Ethiopian officials as well as members of the clergy. They were informed that the Abuna, the head of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, had requested an audience with them. The trio was ushered in to meet His Holiness Abuna Theophilus, who was accompanied by other members of the clergy. The Abuna recalled the first visit of the Rastafarians in 1961, when they had met with Abuna Basilios, who had since passed away. Abuna Theophilus had now assumed the role as head of the church. He welcomed the delegation warmly and offered his blessings in the tradition of the Ethiopian Orthodox faith. The Rastafarian brethren explained the purpose of their visit, which was to continue the discussions begun during the 1961 mission regarding settlement in Ethiopia. They also requested an audience with His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie, as well as assistance with accommodations during their stay in Ethiopia. Shortly afterward, the trio was taken to the Imperial Palace to see the Emperor. At the time, Haile Selassie was granting audiences to various foreign ambassadors in Addis Ababa. The three Jamaicans stood in line, waiting their turn to meet him. When the emperor saw Mack, Clayton, and Alvaranga, he asked, "Are you the Rastafarian brethren?" They replied, "Yes, your majesty," and proceeded to present their gifts, including a hand-carved wooden globe featuring Africa and a large letter V. Selassie responded enthusiastically, saying, "That's Africa." The delegation explained that the carving represented Africa's growing influence in the world. They also presented a list of signatures along with the names and skills of people in Jamaica who wished to settle in Ethiopia. The emperor told them he would be in touch soon. After shaking his hand, they departed. For a time, the trio was accommodated by Abuna Theophilus and priests of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. During this period, they engaged in long discussions about Rastafari beliefs and the question of the divinity of the emperor. Upon learning that the emperor held daily court hearings where he personally listened to the grievances of his subjects, the Rastafarian brethren went to wait outside Menelik's old palace, where these hearings were held. While waiting among the crowd, the emperor spotted the three Jamaicans and ordered his chauffeur to stop. The men did not initially understand what was happening until a police captain approached them and informed them that His Majesty had requested their presence at the Imperial court hearing that day. Inside Menelik's palace, the trio observed the emperor presiding over court, hearing appeals from citizens seeking justice after earlier court decisions. However, despite these encounters, the emperor had not yet granted them a formal private audience. They spent several weeks in Addis Ababa, learning the culture and hearing the many languages spoken throughout the country. During this time, they also visited the emperor's lion enclosure and were invited inside by the caretaker. They entered the lion's den and stood calmly as the lions slowly circled them, curious but calm, an experience the Rastafarians later described as deeply symbolic. During their stay, they met with David Talbot, a West Indian who was working for the Ethiopian government under Haile Selassie. Talbot served in several roles in Ethiopia and also owned a farm, which he told the group was being managed by a Rastafarian from Jamaica. Talbot invited them to visit the farm, where they met Brother Moses, a Jamaican Rastafarian who had first migrated to England and later made his way to Ethiopia, where he now lived on Talbot's farm with his Ethiopian wife and children. The trio spent about a week on the farm, observing rural Ethiopian life. While there, Brother Moses taught them how to use a rifle, explaining that it was necessary for protection against hyenas and other wildlife that roamed the area. After their stay on the farm, the three men returned to Addis Ababa. They became frequent visitors to the Imperial Palace and developed friendships with several members of the palace circle, including the Minister of the Palace, Ato Tafara Kidan Work. On several occasions, they saw the emperor again, including during the Christmas celebrations on December 25th, when members of the American Diplomatic Corps and a choir from the United States sang Christmas carols for the emperor and his family at the palace. After almost 6 months in Ethiopia, during which the emperor himself bore the cost of their expenses, in April 1965, the three men were granted an official audience with His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie to discuss the purpose of their mission. This was the climax of their visit and the very reason they had left Jamaica, to discuss the settlement of black people from Jamaica and the wider West in Ethiopia. They walked up the palace steps and through the red-carpeted halls as they made their way toward the emperor. When they entered the room, they saw the emperor dressed in white, seated on a raised dais. He was flanked by his grandchildren, cabinet ministers, as well as Abuna Theophilus and several clergymen. The three men approached, bowed before the emperor, and began reciting the words of Psalm 9. "I will praise thee, O Lord, with my whole heart. I will show forth thy marvelous works." As they recited the psalm, the emperor was visibly moved and reached for a white handkerchief, wiping a tear from his eye. The emperor then spoke to them, explaining that they had now been in Ethiopia long enough to understand some of the problems the country faced. He told them that Ethiopia had never had a godfather, as many other African countries did after independence, referring to the assistance former colonial powers sometimes provided to their former colonies. Ethiopia, he explained, had many problems to attend to. Nevertheless, He told them that Ethiopia would welcome the Rastafari brethren to reside there, stating that Ethiopia was a large country with land available for resettlement. The emperor emphasized that Ethiopia was in need of technical skills and trained people from the West, and said he would make contact with the Jamaican government to continue discussions and establish the necessary framework. He then commissioned the Rastafarians to return to Jamaica, organize the people there, and inform them of the realities of Ethiopia. After the meeting, the three men thanked the emperor for his hospitality and for covering their expenses during their stay. The emperor then presented them with gold coins. They also invited the emperor to visit Jamaica, and he promised that he would. True to his word, arrangements were made for their return journey to Jamaica by way of London and New York, financed by the emperor. The trio returned, excited to report the results of their mission not only to the Rastafari in Jamaica, but also to the African Repatriation Committee, the organization they had co-founded before leaving for Africa. However, upon their return, they discovered that the organization, which had been formed in Gladstone Robinson's Brooklyn apartment, had come under scrutiny by the FBI. The three men were questioned about their association with members of the African Repatriation Committee, whom they then learned had traveled to Jamaica and become entangled in a conspiracy involving the smuggling of marijuana from Jamaica to the United States. Robinson and other members of the committee had gone to Jamaica and, through Mortimer Plano, established relationships with Rastafarians there. This had been done without the knowledge or consent of Clayton, Mack, and Alvaranga. The original intention had been to establish a branch of the organization in Jamaica after the Africa mission, but Robinson, possibly through his EWF contacts, had traveled to Jamaica on his own initiative to build connections. Their activities eventually caught the attention of Jamaican authorities, and Robinson was declared persona non grata and sent back to the United States. Although the FBI interrogated the three men, it became clear that they had no knowledge of the activities that had taken place in their absence, and they were allowed to return to Jamaica. With the organization they had helped found now in disarray, Mack and Alvaranga were deeply disappointed in Robinson and the other members of the African Repatriation Committee. Upon returning to Jamaica, they formed a new organization on May 26, 1965, called the Rastafari Brethren Repatriation Association. Back in Jamaica, they attempted to engage the government and encourage officials to act on the findings of their mission, but to no avail. The relationship between the Jamaican government and the Rastafari community was still deteriorating. However, the following year would mark a turning point. On April 21, 1966, 4 years to the day after their first meeting with the Emperor, Haile Selassie visited Jamaica. His visit would dramatically change how Rastafari were perceived by the wider Jamaican society. As the public began to view the movement with greater respect, the government slowly began to respond, and over time, some of the discriminatory practices against the Rastafari community were gradually eased. The desire for repatriation to Africa continued. However, some groups began shifting their strategy toward organizing collective migration independently to Ethiopia, rather than waiting on government programs. The land at Shashamane gradually became home to many settlers, not only from Jamaica, but from across the Caribbean and the wider Western world. The journey was not without its difficulties, but through determination, many eventually found their way to the land that Emperor Haile Selassie had granted.